You know by now that each generation of artists rebels against the preceding generation. In this second-to-last unit, the process speeds up and the revolutions come fast and furious. In part, I suspect this reflects the quickening pace of technological change and the social and emotional impact of two total wars. Photography played a role as well. Even the most perfect illusionist painting is going to capture less of optical reality than a camera, which invites artists to define reality in terms of hidden emotions, or the subconscious, or an oppressive economic superstructure, or even to deny that we can grasp reality at all. Stay tuned. So why did the Post-Impressionists rebel against the Impressionists? You read about this. Basically, they became impatient with the very element of Impressionist art that the Impressionists had embraced, its transience. Post-Impressionists struggled to capture the more essential underlying realities, but they did this in very different ways. So let's look at two seascapes. Bottom left is a painting by Winslow Homer, a somewhat romantic American realist. In the upper right, you see the painting by Monet that gave Impressionism its name. Clearly, the Monet moves closer to abstraction. But what do these paintings have in common? Well, each intends to capture a particular fleeting moment. They share a somewhat identifiable perspective. We can more or less figure out where we, the viewer, stand or swim in relation to the scene. They use color vividly but still realistically. Remember that the Impressionists are trying to show how our eyes actually capture and convey color to our minds. And here we have two depictions of a sower. On the left, a painting by realist Millet, and on the right by post-impressionist Vincent van Gogh, who modeled his painting after Millet. So Millet is capturing the hard work but also the poetry of labor. Van Gogh, sorry, I said Van Gogh earlier, it's Van Gogh. Van Gogh seeks a deeper symbolic meaning. As he explained, and these are his own words, quote, "The sower and the wheat sheaf stood for eternity, and the reaper and his scythe for irrevocable death. Note that the wheat fields are suddenly blue and that the sunset comes alive with radiating lines. Color and line take on new responsibilities in Van Gogh's paintings, and the content reflects a new reliance on symbolism." So here we see the post-impressionist gang of four. From the upper left, moving clockwise, Seurat, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne. They seem a rather Actually, I should have said Cézanne, Gauguin, should not. Sorry about that. They seem a rather odd cast of characters. I would not describe these painters or their techniques as especially similar. And in fact, the art critic who first lumped these four together, along with the young Picasso, chose the name post-impressionist really as an act of despair. He was searching for a more descriptive term, but in the end, the only element he knew they had in common was that they had been heavily influenced by the Impressionists, but wanted to take their art a step further. Actually, I think there's another pretty clear unifying element, which is a fascination with the expressive power of color. Now, we're going to encounter this term expressive or expressionism a lot in this unit. Your textbook defines expression as, quote, "the result of the artist's unique inner or personal vision, and that often has an emotional dimension." Expressionism contrasts with art focused on visually describing the empirical world, unquote. So it's art, if you will, seen with an inner eye. By the way, the latest edition of Gardner's adds a fifth post-impressionist, Toulouse-Lautrec. He is not on our list, although you read about him, I hope. But here's his version of Le Moulin de la Galette, painted much more ominously at night. Note that he's using color to create a somewhat more menacing scene. And here's another of his paintings of Paris nightlife with a darker and more satirical edge and a very strange use of color. Catch that blue face. Notice also you have a stronger use of line, which is characteristic of the post-impressionists. Okay, we're going to be looking a lot at color in this unit, so I thought now might be a good time to review the concepts of hue, value, and saturation. We haven't talked about this for a long time. So hue, again, is what we usually think of as color, red, blue, yellow, green, etc. Value is defined as the relative lightness or darkness of a color. It's an important tool for artists because they can use value to define form and to create spatial illusions, modeling. If values are close, light against light, dark against dark, the shapes will seem to flatten out and seem closely connected in space. None will stand out from the others. If there's a strong contrast, we have not only dramatic lighting, but modeling. Of course, we see that in Baroque art. Your textbook defines saturation as the brightness or dullness of a hue, but a better definition is that saturation refers to the dominance of the hue or the purity of the color. So a very bright red is a pure hue. As the saturation is reduced, the image becomes grayer, and eventually you have what your printer prompt will call grayscale. Other color effects are produced not by manipulating hue, value, and saturation, but by playing with the contrast between colors, our famous word, juxtaposition. So let's look first at the 3 panels on top. The very same colors are used in each panel, yet depending on the choice of the dominant color, the feeling of the composition and even the appearance of each color is changed. The bottom panel illustrates the principle of simultaneous contrast. So this is a phenomenon where it occurs when a color appears to change when it's seen against a different background. So this phenomenon was first explained in the 19th century by Michel Chevreul. You read about him. He was a dye master for the Gobelin tapestry works, who became an important color theoretician, whose books Seurat and Cézanne in particular studied very carefully. Chevreul discovered the changes in the hue, value, and saturation, and also in the area. In other words, the amount of space that a color occupies of a background color will alter the appearance of the selected color. So the print here shown here on the bottom is made up of wavy bands of color. Some of the bands extend from the center panel and intrude into areas of contrasting hue in the side panels. And these extended bands are in fact the same hue and the same value throughout, but they appear to change from left to right. So we'll see Cézanne in particular plays with these concepts in Mont Sainte-Victoire. But the Post-Impressionists weren't just playing with the expressive powers of color. They were also trying to solve what they saw as 2 problems with Impressionism. I talked about this a little bit at the beginning. The first perceived problem was that the Impressionists' effort to capture a brief, fleeting moment meant that Impressionist paintings lost some of the ability to capture the reality of a 3-dimensional world, something that painting's been about for a long time in the Western tradition. To try to see what bothered the Post-Impressionists, let's look back at a painting from Monet's Rouen Cathedral. In capturing the momentary appearance of this building in different light, Monet does sacrifice some of what those Renaissance and Baroque painters worked so hard to capture, which is the illusion of form in space. So I've snipped and blown up a square out of one of Monet's cathedral renditions. See how when you get up close, the shapes essentially disappear into brushstrokes. The Post-Impressionists saw this as a loss, and it was this realization that prompted the quote from Renoir that he realized he no longer knew how to paint or draw. Partly in response, Post-Impressionist painters again reintroduced line as a significant design element. The other problem that some Post-Impressionists had with Impressionist painters was their insignificant, in quotes, content. Now, I love this painting, but Renoir really is not trying to convey a deep message. The Post-Impressionists and even more artists from some of the later art schools we're going to be examining felt that painting should address eternal concepts and sometimes have really a social use or impact. And we've already seen how Van Gogh imbued his sower with a deeper symbolic importance. Okay, what a long-winded intro. Sorry, a lot of these points will be important throughout this unit. So let's turn to a closer look at some works. Georges Seurat and Pointillism used to show up all the time on the AP test, but they're off the list. Seurat created his pointillist paintings with tiny dots of color that seem from a distance blend and produce light-filled canvases, like the Impressionists, but with a much stronger line. Don't take my word for it. Let's hear from an even more noted art historian, Bugs Bunny. He's actually going to run in and out of a bunch of our required works for this unit, so I hope you have time to watch this short clip. Well, I've cut out lots of my earlier lecture on Seurat, but I will note that his highly scientific color juxtaposition produced works that, to me at least, seem a little frozen. No one could accuse our next gang member, Vincent van Gogh, of painting frozen scenes. Wheatfield with Crows may have been his last painting. Just a few weeks later, he would be dead of a probably self-inflicted gunshot wound to the abdomen. So this painting's in your textbook. Now that you know something about Post-Impressionist concerns, what Post-Impressionist elements do you see here? Well, like Seurat, Van Gogh uses complementary colors to create an impact. But his colors are bold, jarring, disturbing, and like Seurat, he seeks to restore line, but Van Gogh's lines pulse with movement. Rather than tiny dots, he applies paint in thick swaths with thick raised brushstrokes impasto, remember? That in and of themselves convey line. So here's what he wrote to his brother Theo, who supported Vincent van Gogh throughout his painting career. Quote, "Instead of trying to reproduce exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color more arbitrarily to express myself more forcibly. Van Gogh chose the red and green for this painting not only for the retinal effect produced by complementary colors, but also because, in his own words, red and green, quote, express the terrible passions of humanity. The room is blood red," unquote. By contrast, Van Gogh explained that he deliberately chose the colors in this painting of the bedroom in his retreat at Arles to convey serenity and peaceful retreat. So this is probably Van Gogh's most famous work, and like many of his greatest paintings, it was produced as Van Gogh struggled with depression and fits of delusion. He actually painted Starry Night in an asylum where he had committed himself. Many of you made very interesting comments about this work when we had our summer discussions. Now let's hear from our presenter. So Van Gogh was a friend and colleague of our next gang member, Paul Gauguin. In fact, the two men spent 2 months together painting in Van Gogh's retreat in Arles. The visit ended badly. According to Gauguin's account, on the evening of December 23, 1888, Van Gogh confronted him with a razor, demanding to know if he intended to leave Arles. Gauguin confirmed that he did intend leaving. He found Van Gogh's behavior disturbing and erratic. Van Gogh turned and fled, and disturbed by his companion's irrational behavior, Gauguin went off to spend the night in a hotel. The following morning, when Gauguin returned to the yellow house where they were painting together, he found it spattered with blood. Taken into custody by the police for interrogation, he discovered that Van Gogh had returned home after their confrontation and mutilated his left ear. He was taken to a hospital, and Gauguin returned to Paris, and Van Gogh never saw him again. Here's Van Gogh's painting of the aftermath. But back to Gauguin. Like other post-impressionists, he sought to convey more meaning in his paintings. I wish I had more time for this painting. If you're interested, there's a good Khan Academy podcast about it. But note the expressive as opposed to realistic use of color. The grass in Brittany, where Gauguin painted this work, is not scarlet. Nor does the painting capture, as Impressionists tried to, a fleeting moment in real time. In a letter to Van Gogh, Gauguin explicitly explained, "For me, the landscape and the fight exist only in the imagination of the people praying after the sermon." They're seeing Jacob's ladder. Unlike Van Gogh, however, and more like the Impressionists, Gauguin deliberately flattened and twisted his pictorial space. Note how the juxtaposition of strong colors values helps to produce this effect. Here, Gauguin is also reflecting the influence of Japanese woodblock prints. Note the similarity between Jacob wrestling with the angel and Hokusai prints of sumo wrestlers. So Gauguin painted in Brittany to escape what he saw as the corruption of city life. And I might note that Gauguin was also escaping the responsibility of a wife and 5 children, whom he pretty much left to fend for themselves. Anyway, Brittany didn't prove to be far enough away. In 1891, he persuaded the French government to sponsor a trip to Tahiti, where he would record the people and their customs. There, he developed a taste for underage girls, contributed to the local syphilis infestation, and painted what he himself described as primitive scenes. Riddled with disease and nearing death, Gauguin painted this grim vision of the cycle of life and death. And now let's hear from another presenter. Okay, there's a danger I'm repeating what you've already discussed, but I want to make sure you noticed his heavy use of symbolism with the various figures representing the stages of life. So the baby at the far right signifies newborn life. The figure of questionable sex, whose back is turned to the viewer, is interpreted by some art historians to symbolize the beginning of an individual's realization of gender. The apple-picking male and the girl to his left, who sits eating an apple, reenact the fable of Adam and Eve, the quest for knowledge, and of course the discovery of sex. The old lady at the far left of the frame sits on the verge of death, unclothed, as a parallel perhaps to the baby on the painting's far right. Okay, back before I was teaching art history, I tended to view Cézanne as just one more impressionist. In fact, many art historians view Cézanne as the true founder of modern art. Like Seurat, he studied the science of color, and like all the post-impressionists, he worried that impressionist paintings lacked form, structure, and content. So let's hear from the next presenter about this work. Okay, just one comment. This painting is an extended experiment in color juxtaposition. The small patches of juxtaposed colors with the cool colors receding and the warm colors advancing toward us help give a sense of spatial depth. This was quite deliberate. And in fact, I need to talk a little bit about Cézanne's use of perspective because it's so important. What really makes Cézanne the founder of modern and even abstract art is the way he plays with the viewer's perspective. Since the Renaissance, artists had struggled to create an illusion of space on a two-dimensional canvas. Cézanne rejects one-point perspective, and instead, he tries to capture the same scene from different viewing positions, and even from different points in time. Basically, he wants to have it all. He wants to create an illusionistic three-dimensional space, and he wants to expose the two-dimensional reality of all paintings. Modern art is meta-art. In other words, it's often art about the making of art. Some of his techniques are easier to see in this rather similar painting. So note how he adopts the Impressionist short brushstrokes, I should say, grouping related colors into blocks of color. He also reintroduces traditional black shadows and outlines. But, and this is why I stopped myself, Cézanne's brushstrokes actually evolved. Initially, he used the thick impasto-style brushstrokes like Monet's, but under the influence of Pissarro, he moved toward much lighter applications of paint. And that's what he uses in Mount St. Victoire. And by the way, I only discovered that, hint, hint, when I was prepping for your test. So understand that loose brushstrokes are not always the same as heavy brushstrokes. I don't think I understood that when I made this podcast last year. Again, this snip gives you a sense of how Cézanne used blocks of color and a stronger line. Basically, he's trying to get us to look at a picture two-dimensionally up close and three-dimensionally when we back up and regain a sense of depth and space. So back to Mont Saint Victoire. Note that Cézanne uses atmospheric perspective to help create depth. It's bluer and paler in the back, lower values. Yet the patches of color do not get smaller as they move further back. So again, the landscape provides both an illusion of three-dimensional space and a two-dimensional use of color. On to a couple of very strange end-of-century paintings.